Ah, Greece, the place that laid the foundation of modern-day thinking about economics, logic, and so much more. It had colonies all over the Mediterranean and had an empire that spanned all the way from Macedonia to Pakistan. But it's been through some hard times. Under the Ottomans, they were enslaved and experienced many genocides. Oftentimes, the strongest boys were taken to be slaves in the Janissary Corps, a vicious military elite battalion, and the girls would be taken to join the harems. And now it's going through an absolutely terrible time with one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, and one of the worst debt to GDP ratios, and the highest brain drain in the world. So what's been the biggest contributing factor? It's something that Greece was the birthplace of. I'll give you a second to try and guess what it was. It's democracy. How was democracy at fault, you may ask? Well, you see, the politicians would borrow a whole heap of money and not invest it properly. They would waste it on things that Greece did not need, like more unemployment benefit and retiring much earlier. So they would be spending a lot of money and not taxing a lot. And when the next party would take over, they would realize, oh my gosh, what a mess we're in! And so they would have to also borrow money again, or else they'd be voted out. The modern state of Greece got democracy after a communist party overthrew the Nazis in Greece. Then the Brits helped a democratic regime overthrow the communists, because Brits would always wet their beds at the thought of Russia having a warm water seaport. So I'm gonna have the Greeks not get conquered by the Nazis at all. And I know I could start this timeline with a much earlier initial point of divergence, but many of you guys preferred my more recent alternate history timeline to my older one because it was more recent, and the next alternate history timeline is going to start after this one starts. So see this as a challenge to avoid the economic crisis without any points of departure before 1939. And yes, I know Greece had a dictatorship in the 70s and 60s, but Greece actually got richer after that dictatorship ended. So how does Greece avoid being conquered by the Nazis, you may ask? First, the gods from Olympus come down and... no, I'm just kidding. The god of the Greek Orthodox Church comes down to kill some papists and proties. No, you got me. I was kidding again. I'm going to have France do better in the war, but not so good that they managed to stop the Germans from driving through the Maginot Line. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invaded Greece at all, considering that their plan was to knock out both Britain and France and then go east. In the end, they only settled for knocking out France. I think in any alternate timeline where they managed to breach the Maginot Line, they would still go east after a couple more months after they invaded east in our timeline. The French would have to keep the Germans out of Flanders, or else they wouldn't have tied down so many of the Germans that the Greeks would be able to last throughout the rest of the war. All France would have to do in this alternate timeline in order to have done that much better in this alternate timeline is place a large force to protect the Ardennes, because the unit that was screening it was a very green unit with little training. If a stronger force with some anti-tank guns had been situated across the rise from the forest edge, it would have blunted the Panzer Corps attack and may have allowed for time for reinforcements to move up. So Italy would not help out Germany in the fight against France. Italy did not declare war on France until it was inevitable that they would have been conquered by the Germans. Then Italy would invade Greece and fail just like it did in our timeline. Then Germany would be like, alright, we'll help you conquer Greece if you help us take on France. And Mussolini would have to accept this offer because of how embarrassing it would be to lose a war against a much smaller country. Now, for Greece to survive until December 1941, Ioannis Metaxas, who was the fascist dictator of Greece at the time, would have to live longer because after he died, King George took over and he was too timid to make some ballsy moves that Metaxas would pull off, like threatening to deport Slavic speakers from Macedonia to the Croatian Free State or Nazi Germany, and Greek Jews to Nazi Germany, or Christian Arabs that Ataturk had deported to Greece, to Lebanon, if they don't serve in the army to help him. To make sure the Germans don't take Greece by December 1941, in this alternate timeline, Ioannis Metaxas will have the leadership leadership of Alexander the Great. Now here's why they would only have to hold off the Germans until December 1941. Stalin was planning on invading Germany, and December that year is when I'm going to have Stalin invade Germany, because by that time it would have been winter in Russia and much of Europe, and ice/snow was Stalin's element. So after reverse Operation Barbarossa happens, the Germans are going to have to pull a lot of soldiers out of Greece and onto the new Russian front. This would make Greece a major port for the Allies to open a new front against Germany when the USSR attacks the Third Reich. At the very least, the Brits and Americans pour guns and ammo into the province to arm the Greeks, but also to arm the Yugoslav, Bulgarian and other partisans and rebels that filled the Balkans. But not Hungarian partisans, as Hungary had close ties to Germany. The Germans will have troops on the border to stop crossings, but there's a lot of mountains and passes in there, and if the Persians were able to sneak 500,000 men up a goat path to surprise the Spartans, how much better can a few Greek soldiers do? I mean, every day in the United States, hundreds, if not thousands, of moonshiners, meth makers, and pot growers go throughout the Appalachia, avoid US patrols and searchers, and stay hidden despite modern planes, optics, and satellite imagery. So eventually the Allies will land some troops there, partially for a new front, and partially to open the Balkan states to not being a part of the soon-to-be Warsaw Pact. Also to pin down the Axis troops in Europe from moving to Sicilian, French or Russian fronts. This won't actually take much, with freedom fighters blowing up everything behind the lines that's flammable and explosive. In fact, I think we can see Greece teaming up with the Chetniks to conquer the Macedonian regions of Bulgaria, with the USSR taking the rest after they liberate Serbia, perhaps even all of Yugoslavia. And I don't think anybody would be conquering Romania, seeing as in our timeline they joined the Axis very unwillingly. This means Romania would never be communist. After the Germans are driven out of Greece, Metaxas would likely reconquer and reoccupy the North Epirus region of Albania, which had a large Greek community, and expel the Albanians living there. Although this is bad, human rights violated by the government against the Greek population in Albania will be avoided. The Albanian government has targeted the Greek population via police and secret service, according to human rights organizations. Greek communities have been targeted by development projects and had their homes demolished, and ethnic targeting of Greeks in southern Albania. There were cases of mistreatment of members of the Greek minority by the authorities as well. Systematic persecution of Greek communities in Albania has come on issuing demolition orders on Greek national holidays, often under the proviso of development, but only affect ethnic Greeks and restrict and target educational buildings. After the war, with the need for a large port facility to support naval resupply, large air bases to support air operations, and munition dumps, Greece is getting a huge boost to its economy, especially if local arm manufacturers can supply the bullets and shells for the Allies. It will also have some of the most modern airports already for use in massively enlarged port facilities and a commanding position in the eastern Mediterranean and Adriatic Sea. I mean, they'd already have docking facilities and great ports, not to mention improved roadways and rail lines for military use. This is in direct contrast with our timeline, where Greece has the second worst infrastructure in the EU. All this would give Greece a big break, since they just finished paying off a bunch of debt before the war. Considering Greece fits the bill perfectly for a country to bring Britain's colonies closer to home. Another thing Greece will have to do to avoid the economic crisis is, when the United States is passing out all that Rebuild Europe money, is use it to diversify its economy. Eventually, when Metaxas does die, Greece would go from being a fascist state back to an absolute monarchy. How would Romania and Serbia be like in this alternate timeline where they're not in the communist sphere? Well, one thing I've noticed is that countries further south in Europe tend to be more theistic and hence more conservative, with the exceptions being former communist countries and Ireland, because the former communist countries had atheism forced on them and Ireland had Protestantism forced on it, and so they're experiencing a backlash. I've heard that the reason why further southern European countries tend to be more theistic and conservative is because they're poorer, but Switzerland is one of the wealthiest countries in Europe and is more theistic and conservative than all the countries further north from it. I've also heard that Catholic countries tend to be more theistic and religious than Protestant countries. But France is Catholic, and Switzerland is Protestant, and Switzerland is more theistic and conservative than France is. So I'm going to say that Romania would be geopolitically and economically like the southernmost parts of Austria that were never communist in this alternate timeline. As for Serbia, it's not actually poor because of communism. In fact, Tito's Yugoslavia can't really be communist. It's much closer to industrial democracy than to communism. There was private property, and wages even varied because of supply and demand. Workers just had a much larger say in their companies compared to capitalism. Yugoslavia's economy was even growing by 7% every year. Serbia is poor today because of American bombs. A good thing for Serbia in this alternate timeline is it would be much bigger and hence would have much more land to draw resources from. The reason why Serbia is so small and powerless today is because of Tito federalizing the hell out of Serbian lands. Oh yeah, and when the Chetniks take over, there will be a lot of revenge killings against Croats because of all the war crimes they committed against Serbians in World War II. So Serbia would have an economy somewhere in between Croatia and Slovenia if they didn't use euros in this alternate timeline. Now I'm going to talk about the impact of Romania not being in the Warsaw Pact before I move on to the rest of what would happen to Greece in this alternate timeline, instead of doing this chronologically. On the border of Ukraine, which is a part of the USSR, and Romania, there are the Carpathian Mountains. They would definitely leave the USSR exposed and give them a much harder time, so the Cold War is definitely going to end earlier. The capitalist powers would exploit this. They would send men through the Carpathian Mountains to radicalize Ukrainians, similarly to what they did in Afghanistan in our timeline. But the radicalization would not be as effective, considering Afghanistan had just been conquered by the Russians. Meanwhile, Ukraine would have been under the thumb of communist Moscow for decades by this point. We can expect some IRA-style terrorism, but not suicide bombers or kamikazes. With all this trouble in Ukraine, the Soviets might not invade Afghanistan, or at least pull out before there's as much radicalization of the Afghans. So we might not see Al-Qaeda, and that probably means no 9/11 in this alternate timeline. If there was no 9/11, then George Bush would lose his re-election in 2004, since it was a very close election, and the fear generated by 9/11 definitely gave Bush a lot of votes. If Kerry makes an exit from Iraq during the insurgency, we can expect a different kind of fanatic government to take over, above and beyond what ISIS was. Because of the power vacuum and 4 fewer years of US presence to thin the herd of militants. So terrorism wouldn't be associated with Muslims until about 2004 when he pulls out of Iraq, and that happens. Kerry would lose the 2008 election big time, because Iraq would have blown up under his watch, then Hurricane Katrina, and then finally the 2008 recession. 2004 was a poison chalice. Back to Greece. Another contributor to the economic crisis was strong regionalization. A large proportion of people in Greece live on islands. When you live somewhere isolated, income tax evasion is all too easy. Many Greeks treat income tax evasion like it's a sport. To avoid this, Greece can evacuate some of the small islands with very low populations and build bridges with roads on them between some of the islands. In 1974, when Greece goes to war with Turkey over the island of Cyprus, the roads in between the islands will be very helpful, since massive troop deployments will have been sped up. Another thing is that Greece's population will be larger, considering that many of the atrocities the Nazis committed in Greece, which killed a lot of people, wouldn't have happened. Let's not forget the element of political will here. In 1941, Turkey was the first country to send humanitarian aid to Greece to relieve a famine in Athens caused by the Axis occupation. The Turkish president signed a decision to help people with food that was collected nationwide by a campaign of the Turkish Red Crescent and sent to the port of Istanbul to be shipped to Greece. Wait, what's that? Turkey actually did something nice for Greece? Well, dear viewer, I'm even more surprised than you are. Without that in this alternate timeline, there's a lot more political political will. But teeny tiny Greece is still facing a much more formidable opponent, but they can only do better than they did in our timeline. So I'm going to say they're going to conquer around this much of Cyprus. As you can see from this map, most of Cyprus's flat land is around the border between our timeline's Greek and Turkish Cyprus. So even just doing a tiny bit better would help Greece a lot, because flat land is something it severely lacks. After they've shown the Turks what they're capable of, Greece will be able to decrease its military budget. Greece has always spent far beyond the NATO minimum requirements of 2% of its GDP on the military. The United States is the only country in NATO that spends more of its GDP on the military. Most countries in NATO don't even pay the minimum 2% of their GDP on their armies. France had plans on making Lebanon its own little Israel, but because it was so weakened from World War II, it was unable to carry out these plans. It wanted to use the Christians in Lebanon to carry out this plan. But in this alternate timeline, where France is much less weakened by the war, and Greece deported several Arab Christians to Lebanon, the Christians would definitely win the Lebanese civil war. That means Hezbollah would never have taken root in Lebanon, and the country would have bounced back much more swiftly after the civil war. Then they would have formed a coordination of some sort with Israel against other nations. The Lebanese Muslims would then flee to Syria, and the Arab states would start sanctioning Lebanon like they do Israel. And since most of these Muslims would be Shia, the Shia population of Syria would increase. This means Assad would have a much tighter relationship with Iran. So when the equivalent of ISIS in this alternate timeline pops up, Syria might do better fighting against them. But the difference between the mainstream Shia and the Alawites might have a destabilizing effect on the Assad's family grip on power and force them to ship alliances around to counterbalance the Shia influence, like how Alawites are allowed to drink alcohol and celebrate Christmas. Moving into the 90s, more problems for Greece popped up. Severely aging population caused by a high life expectancy and very low fertility rates, combined with an early minimum age of retirement, 55 years old. They didn't increase their minimum age of retirement until they got a bailout from Germany. Then they increased it to 70 years old. To be honest, if they just introduced a higher minimum age of retirement in the 90s, they wouldn't have needed to make it go as high as 70 years old. In this alternate timeline, I'll have Greece increase its minimum age of retirement to 67.5 years old. As for the low fertility rates, they can actually help a country in the short term. With a smaller population and the amount of land remains the same, buying land becomes cheaper and so does rent. And the country doesn't need to import as many non-renewable natural resources like oil, or can export more with a smaller population. The fertility rate below the replacement rate, the country won't have to worry about building new schools. However, if a fertility rate is too low for too long, the country will end up with a shortage of working age people and an excess of retired people. And the young people end up getting taxed extra to pay for the elderly people to just feed themselves. People spend about 16 years in primary and high school, so I'm going to have Greece start putting in attempts to raise the fertility rate and eventually have the fertility rate exceed or match the replacement rate in 1999, 16 years after they dropped below the replacement rate. To increase the fertility rate, I'm going to have Greece place heavy taxes on contraceptives and abortions. This will definitely work, as Greece has one of the highest abortion rates in Europe and is the most sexually active country in the world. This would also partially reverse the sexual revolution in Greece. A side effect of this is that with less contraceptives, there's going to be more AIDS, particularly in male homosexuals, so Greece would be more homophobic in this alternate timeline because they'd be more associated with AIDS. And for those of you wondering why not just make abortion illegal in Greece, you can ask Nicolae Ceausescu how well that went down. With Greece being wealthier, thanks to all my points of departure, would attract more immigrants. However, they would make up a smaller proportion of the Greek population because Greece would have a larger and younger population. Let's go over where these new immigrants would come from. For the figures without my input, that is because I am unsure whether most of the people from these countries living in Greece are illegals, or because many of them are pensioners, and hence there would be about the same amount of them. As for the countries not on the Wikipedia page, that I think would have larger populations, the most similar language to Greek spoken outside of Greece is Armenian, and there are about 11,000 Armenians living in Greece in our timeline. I think there should be about 13 to 19,000 in this alternate timeline. Another thing is Greek influenced Latin, so Greek is a bit similar to the Romance languages, but Greek is far more complex than any of them. The most complex of the Romance languages is Romanian, and I've been over Romanians, but the second most complex Romance language is Portuguese. Most Portuguese emigrants moved to France. I don't think they'd move to Greece because of how much easier French is to learn, and many Portuguese in France even say that they prefer the weather there to back home, and Portugal has a very similar climate to Greece. What about other places in the Lusosphere? The countries in Africa that speak Portuguese usually have people speaking their tribe's language as a first language, and then they speak Portuguese as a second language, so I think it would be pretty hard for them to learn Greek as a third language. But then we've got Brazilians. Moving from Brazil to Portugal and then to France would be a big change, but I think it would be a bit less shocking for them to move to Greece because Greece is warmer than France. But it's still easier for Portuguese speakers to learn English because Greek has a different alphabet. So why don't they just move to the United States, which has parts that have climates even more similar to Brazil? Well, one pull factor that I think Greece would have for Brazilians that the United States wouldn't have is that it's more easygoing. The next place I think we'd see a lot of immigrants in Greece from is southern Italy. Because of the ancient Greek colonies in Italy, particularly in the south, many of the southern Italian languages and dialects have been heavily influenced by Greek, namely the Calabrian and Neapolitan dialects of Italian and the Sicilian language. I think we can see a lot in the Ionian Islands since they were occupied by Venice for a long time, and hence the dialect of Greek spoken in those areas has a lot of Italian influence. However, there are no big cities there. In fact, the biggest city in the Ionian Islands only has a population of about 27,000, so I think we could probably see proportionally a lot there, but not that many. The Greek Aegean Islands were occupied by the Italian colonial empire much more recently. Examples as to how Italian has influenced the Greek dialects in the Aegean are oftentimes people in Rhodes say the Italian word for sandwich panini, and mainland Greeks have no idea what they're talking about. The Greek word for and is kia, and Aegean Greeks often say it more like it's pronounced che. The largest city in the Aegean, which is in Rhodes, has a population of 86,000. Now I know that's not a very big city either, but it would be much larger in this alternate timeline due to less Greeks emigrating because Greece is an absolute monarchy and hence wouldn't be able to join the European Union and would have a better economy. So I think just due to those two factors, this city would have a population of about 100,000. So that's probably where we're going to see the most Italian immigrants. And I think that Italians living in Rhodes are going to be the immigrant group that will experience the most racism because southern Italians are often associated with the mafia, and I feel as though many Greeks there would see them as recolonizers. Since Greece will have so many more immigrants coming from countries with better FIFA teams than it, and it will have a much younger population, I'm sure Greece will make it to the 2022 World Cup. Heck, I even think that they'll make it to the quarter-finals. Even though I said Greece wouldn't be in the European Union, what I do think Greece would be in is something a bit like the Schengen area. I could see them forming this agreement with some of the European countries where they let immigrants in from the EU that have qualifications in fields that Greece is lacking, and that would explain why there are so many immigrants in Greece from EU countries, but to not let Greeks move to those countries. Another impact of Greece not being in the European Union, still want to emigrate, if not for economic reasons, at least for more freedom and democracy. So we'd see a larger Greek presence in the United States, Canada and Australia. At the end of the 2000s, Greece and Cyprus were only 2 of 5 countries in the EU to experience some sort of crisis, the other 3 being Portugal, Spain, Ireland. Those crises, along with the Greek crises, all ended up in making each other even worse because their economies were so closely tied to one another. So without the Greek economic crisis, these other crises wouldn't have been as bad. And even though Italy didn't have a crisis, it was surrounded by countries on both sides that did. Therefore, Italy's economy was worsened. With one less crisis and the other crises being lessened, Germany would have more money to pass out to bail out the other countries. So I'm going to say that Portugal's unemployment rate would would have only gone up about as high as Slovakia's did, France as high as Portugal's did, Italy's as high as France's did, and Spain's as high as Italy's did. The weakening of the Eurozone caused by all of these crises negatively impacted some of the countries that they import many goods from, particularly Zambia. So imagine Zambia doing slightly better in this timeline. Overall, Greece would have a good relationship with Denmark, since the ruling house of Greece would be from Denmark originally. Many would see Greece as a part of the Middle East as opposed to Europe because of it being a dictatorship, and especially since most of Cyprus is a part of Greece, and Greece would have an economy similar to that of Chukotka if it had a similar purchasing power parity to the rest of Russia. Less natural resources, but higher minimum wage. I'm talking around 350 rubles an hour, with more agriculture, tourism, industry and merchant shipping to make up for the less natural resources and to give it a purchasing power parity similar to the rest of Russia. Thank you guys so much for watching all that. Please like, share, subscribe and leave me a comment.